think this is a fascinating thing, which Menninger really endorsed in his work. There's some neat writings of Menninger in 1959, who commented that rather no classification than a false one. The lack of any classification at least leaves free space for investigation, whereas a false classification leads directly into errors. Here he is quoting Newman as quoted by Llopis, who I'll bring up again in a moment. Importantly, Menninger said, names do not create illness forms. They only comfort the doctors and impress the relatives. And I think that these words echo some of the points that were being made a little bit earlier today. Menninger had done an empirical series of investigations, and most interestingly, he studied people who suffered from influenza in the 1919 in this country. And what he found is that people became ill. They went through a series of decompensations from nervousness and neurotic phenomena through episodic and explosive discharges into states of persistent and severe disorganization. And both he and Llopis, who studied victims of pellagra in the Spanish Civil War, so both Menninger and Llopis, studying systemic illnesses, found that people progressed through these states through neurotic signs, depression, into mania, then showed positive psychotic symptoms, then negative psychotic symptoms, until if they got sicker, they would develop coma and then die. But if they recovered, they would regress through exactly the same series. So this, I think, highlights the non-specificity. These are not specific brain disorders, the flu or pellagra, yet they yield all of the psychiatric phenomenology that we see in what are presumed now to be discrete disorders. Now, I came to this as a neuropsychologist in the late 70s and early 80s when I was working over Dr. Kandel. And this was a neuropsychological evidence trying to distinguish functional from organic cases using neuropsychological testing. And the bottom line is in non-psychotic psychiatric disorders, there's a very good hit rate. Neuropsychological tests are good at distinguishing those cases from people who are organic, people with known brain injuries. But as you proceed through mixed affective disorders, into mixed psychotic disorders, into the acute or reactive schizophrenia, and down into chronic or processed schizophrenia, the rate successively drops, implying a continuum in the severity of neuropsychological deficit as you go from unipolar through bipolar, through paranoid psychoses, through more negative forms of schizophrenia. Similarly, if we look at the scope of the problem, you can see this same, these are effect sizes that discriminate people with these different disorders from healthy people. Unipolar depression hangs out here, bipolar disorder hangs out here, schizophrenia, a much more striking degree of impairment. But again, there's just a continuum of neuropsychological impairment severity that underlies these differences between so-called groups. Similarly, when I started in 1980 to do this research, we used CAT scans, and I had the opportunity to start using MRIs. In my view, over the last 30 years, there is very little evidence of specific structural brain abnormalities that distinguish these disorders other than severity. This just highlights meta-analytic results on ventricular size, total gray matter, and hippocampal volume, which show effect size differences between each of these groups and controls. And you can see that bipolar disorder shows mild deficits in each one of these measurements, while schizophrenia is characterized by a more severe degree of disturbance. Now, interestingly, the idea that these disorders or diseases would be genetically discrete, I think, has now been relatively substantially abandoned. And this is what I think just one slide to represent this entire body of work, but highlights how the risks are substantially shared between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in terms of the underlying genetic risk. And I think more importantly, there's probably a very large number of genes that contribute to both of these disorders. So what we're talking about is the biological risk is likely to be a very multifactorial, polygenic, and that it does not distinguish between these syndromes. The likelihood is that the more severe disorders like schizophrenia are just characterized by a greater number or complexity of the genetic hit. This is another slide which I included for its great beauty, which shows, using an informatics approach, solely looking at clinicians' medical records, that there's substantial overlap between not only bipolar and schizophrenic disorders, but also autism, implying that there's very likely to be a common set of underlying genetic anomalies that dictate a whole host of brain development processes that are shared across these disorders. And indeed, that some of the distinctions may be caused more by severity than by any discrete pathology. I put up a picture of William James because I think that what we need to do is move beyond a descriptive approach and begin to focus on underlying brain biology. William James did better than anyone at observing behavior, and I've put it to all of our psychology trainees to come up with any better description of psychology than William James was able to do, and also he was a good writer. But it needs to be recognized that behavior is not isomorphic with brain function. The distinctions between behavioral states do not imply parallel distinctions between brain states. The fact that we see symptoms like paranoid ideation or mania does not mean that there's a difference in the underlying brain systems that may be implicated. What neuroscience validation demands is links to biological knowledge and cross-scale correlations. We need to know which brain system differences really make a difference with respect to different symptoms, and then use that to help inform our understanding and determine scientifically whether any categories really exist. The appearance of these unique behavioral syndromes just may reflect nonlinear outcomes of what are fundamentally heterogeneous and nonspecific changes in brain function, that there are thresholds for the emergence of certain symptoms, but that these do not mean that there's a unique biology to the different discrete disorders. So to summarize the challenges for neuropsychiatric diagnosis, the current taxonomy is based on consensus, not science or theory. The symptoms have no clear or direct relation to the underlying pathophysiology. The symptoms are generally listed by asking the patients, yet some of the disorders themselves interfere with the validity of report, which I've always found to be ironic. Syndromes lack specificity of treatment, neurocognitive deficits, structural and functional neuroanatomic deficits, and genetic factors. None of those sources of evidence supports the validity of these diagnostic entities. And I think this poses major challenges for patients, academia, industry, government, and society. And this is a slide that I think summarizes some of the gridlock that we are currently in and that are caused by the diagnostic systems that we endorse. Academia developed the DSM to increase reliability of diagnosis, and this was successful. However, the Food and Drug Administration relies on the clinically accepted precedents in order to define syndromes that then can be treated by drugs. Industry has to respond to the FDA guidance, which is then reinforced by academia, as are all the scientific studies that we have to do, which abide by these diagnostic definitions. Trapped in the middle are clinics, insurers, and buried underneath the clinics, insurers are the patients. And thus, I think we're trapped in something that needs to be broken out of in order to advance the science of defining these disorders and syndromes so that we can then unlock the industry to unleash their prodigious power to discover new treatments for these disorders. The DSM, as many of you may know, had a series of panels starting back in 2006 to try to think about the dimensional strategies. This was across all different disorders, including the psychotic disorders. Yet, if you have to use a crystal ball, these are unsubstantiated predictions. I know there's something later on talking about the DSM specifically. I believe that probably the categorical structure will be preserved, that dimensional models will be considered within diagnostic categories, but I doubt they'll be incorporated as more than supplemental information, except for perhaps in the personality disorder areas. So I don't expect any break from the current taxonomy until DSM-6 or 7, which I think is unfortunate for the field. One thing I wanted to include is a quote about consensus about these diagnostic entities, and it was a nice quote from Michael Crichton, a great scientific source, right? It was in an article called Aliens Cause Global Warming, which I also thought was a great title. I thought it was important with respect to these diagnostic issues because it says, I regard consensus science as an extremely pernicious development that ought to be stopped cold in its tracks. Historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It's a way to avoid debate by claiming that the matter is already settled. There is no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus, period. And I think that we should heed some of those words. Now, what about the psychosis proneness traits? Why do they persist? There's high heritability, wide geographic prevalence, but there's a decreased fecundity. People who have psychotic disorders are at a reproductive disadvantage. So how can the genes underlying these traits persist? There must be adaptive advantages. I know this is a theme that this conference has addressed in part. One that we've been focusing on with one of my hats, which is being involved in the Tenenbaum Center for the Biology of Creativity, is to try to understand whether or not creative achievement might be associated with some of these features. And this is a little bit of data, promise not to show very much, but it shows traits like magical ideation, which is seen as a positive schizotypal feature, is actually associated with a greater degree of creative achievement. And if we contrast people who are high in magical ideation scores, these are scores above 15, which is a minority of people, but with those low on magical ideation, we see that there's quite a striking difference between the groups in terms of their creative achievement. And similarly, if we look at the correlations with these positive schizotypy indicators, there are two different things that are widely used. Magical ideation is one of those, perceptual aberrations are others. And then we look at a classic 5-factor personality structure. What we see is that the people who are higher on positive schizotypy indicators tend to be higher on neuroticism, but also higher on openness to new experience, thereby, I think, helping to explain part of this increased creative potential and capacity for cognitive flexibility. Another interesting thing is that they tend to be low on this factor, which is agreeableness. So I think that having a high degree of openness and a low degree of agreeableness is important, and I put myself in that realm. Unfortunately, there's also problems with conscientiousness, and I think that if we have conscientiousness, open, disagreeable people, the world will be a more creative place. Somebody referred to a New York Times article earlier, which was about the Americanization of mental illness. This was just in earlier January. But this article highlights how Western science, philosophy, and cultural beliefs are transforming definitions of mental illness globally, and not necessarily for the better. What was interesting to me is that the prior notion that emphasizing the biological bases of mental illness would decrease stigma is not supported, according to these authors, and I think there's likely to be further discussion of that. What I would conclude is that the currently used diagnoses may one day be considered culture-bound syndromes of the 21st century as we begin to learn about the true brain systems that underlie the causes of our behavioral suffering. And I believe that it would be important for us to decrease the use of categorical boundaries which do not serve scientific, clinical, or social purposes. So the thrilling conclusion, I think there's good reason to believe that a severity continuum via many genes and neural systems is more valuable than a categorical taxonomy to understand the real biology of psychotic disorders, and that understanding the relevant continua may advance the basic science and recognize better individuals' assets to the benefit of patients, families, and society. So with that, I'd like to thank our support. Even though I've gone rogue, we get substantial support from the NIH and also the Michael E. Tenenbaum Family Center for the Biology of Creativity, and also Tim Crow and Professor Barrios, whose article stimulated many of these thoughts. So thank you all for your attention.